Welcome to the Program Design Podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Monique, teacher and curriculum writer turned program mentor and business strategist for coaches, educators, and online experts. Whether you're looking to create your first ever group coaching program or scale your current offer for more freedom, revenue, and consistent income, this is the podcast for you. Here you'll find practical strategies and encouragement mixed with a bit of manifestation and intuition to help you grow and design a program you absolutely love. Let's dive in. Welcome to our 100th episode of the Program Design Podcast. I am so thrilled you're here, and I'm really looking forward to sharing with you 10 lessons that I have learned from 100 podcast episodes. Whether you are creating a podcast, whether you run a podcast, you're thinking of a substack, or you're just curious, this podcast is going to give you some behind the scenes of the lessons I've learned after creating 100 episodes and what you can learn and take from it for your business. But before we jump in, I want to share that I am going to be creating a brand new workshop, a paid workshop coming up later on this month. Okay, so let's dive into today's content. So let's first chat about why setting up a podcast is actually a lot simpler than you think. So this is lesson number 1. And when I was figuring out what I wanted to do with entrepreneurs, I had another podcast for teachers, and folks had asked me, how did you create that podcast? What did that look like? It seems very daunting to create a podcast. So in one of the many offers that I tried out, I helped people set up their podcast with my team. Now, that was not ultimately the offer that I wanted to be known for and that I wanted to create for people, but we did do it a few times for different clients. And what I will say is that most of us tend to think that podcasts are a lot harder to produce than they actually are. It's honestly quite simple. And if you're thinking about creating a podcast, but you're wary of if the whole thing feels daunting, honestly, don't. It's quite simple. Pretty much all that you need is I use Buzzsprout, but basically a platform that will share your podcast out there. It's a low subscription fee that I pay every month. You need a microphone, and you can I got one off of Amazon, and that's pretty much all you need to get started. It's really quite simple to get started. And actually what it made me think of when I first started it is I used to sell, and I still sell, low-priced digital products on a platform called Teachers Pay Teachers. And it's really just like that. It's very simple to just add in your audio. You can edit it, of course, which I'll be sharing in a moment, but you just upload your audio, you upload your show notes, and then you hit publish, and it is ready to go. So it is so much simpler than it might seem. And so if you're feeling I don't know if I've got this set up, how do I even do that? It is very, very easy to publish podcast episodes. So that's my first lesson. It is quite simple to start creating your podcast. Now, how do you actually make sure that you are consistent though? So that is the bigger maybe challenge or something to wrap your mind around. And that's what I want to get into in the next few lessons. So lesson 2 is about creating a system. And of course, if you've been listening to me for any length of time, you know that I love a system. And the reason that we have gotten to 100 episodes, which I should look at the stats on that. I think there aren't very many podcasts that make it to this many episodes. And so one of the reasons that we were able to make it to 100 episodes is because I have a system in place to actually create this podcast. So the first thing that I do that I highly recommend for you in this system is I record the podcast, but someone on my team produces and publishes the podcast for me. Now, this is especially important for me, yes, because she edits it and makes it sound more, she takes out all my ums and little mess ups and things like that I might make and really listens for audio quality and things like that. But honestly, the biggest reason that I recommend having someone on your team edit your podcast for you is because it actually keeps you consistent. It holds you accountable. So I know that I need to get my podcast out very latest by Tuesday so that I make sure that I get it out for Rebecca on my team. Shout out to Rebecca. Because if I don't do it later, I feel bad that it's too last minute for her to do her work. So I make sure that I get it out. And honestly, that is one of the main reasons that this podcast has stayed consistent, because I know Rebecca is going to ask me hey, do you have a podcast episode this week? And half the time I don't. And so I get it done and I send it off to her. I'd love to tell you that I'm really organized. I batch it all, but I don't. It's honestly because I have Rebecca. We use Riverside to record episodes, but you can use Zoom. And the last part of the system is around how I actually create it. So the system to record it is Rebecca edits it, publishes it. We use Riverside and Buzzsprout to actually get the episodes out, right? But how to actually create the episodes regularly in a way that doesn't take up too much time. So what I used to do is I would kind of create my bullet points, I'd record the episode, and then I would record my show notes. But I found that to be quite cumbersome after a while, and it took me a while, and I never got to the show notes. Now, you can absolutely have someone on your team write your show notes for you, but what I do actually is I just create like my outline. Basically, my show notes are my outline. So I create the show notes. If I have some notes that I want to remind myself of, I write them directly in Buzzsprout. I just delete them after I record it. And basically, those are my guidelines to actually create the episode. And then that's my structure for the episode. So I do not script anything. Personally, I do not like the sound of podcasts that have been scripted. You can just hear it. It doesn't feel genuine to me. I don't like it. So I just have my bullet points are my show notes. I kind of riff from there, follow that same structure, and that becomes my podcast episode. So it becomes so much faster when you use bullet points rather than a script. And when you record your bullet points basically as your show notes, you've skipped a step and then you can record and move along. So I am recording this episode and then I'm going to go pick up my kids from camp because I can get it done in that short of time frame. So that is lessons 2 and 3. Lesson 4 is more aligned around thinking about what kind of content to create. So sometimes when I've heard people tell me, I want to create a substack, I want to create a podcast, they worry that they're going to run out of ideas. First off, you're an entrepreneur. You likely will not run out of ideas. But I like to share a few of the ways that I kind of think of ideas to add to the podcast. So the first thing that I like to think about is if you are selling to a previous version of yourself, if your ideal client is a previous version of you, think back to what you read, listened to, consumed when you were in that phase of your journey, and that can become content for you later. So I literally sometimes will look back to my previous self and see what I was listening to, because you can just go back on your podcast app, right? And see what episodes you downloaded back in that year. And that gives me an idea of like, oh, I was wondering about that. I was listening to podcast episodes about that. And that can jog my memory and spark new ideas of what kind of content that I want to create. So think back to your previous self, look back, what were you consuming? And that can create ideas for you to record for your ideal client now. The other source of ideas for me is client conversations. So my best podcasts, generally speaking, the ones that have gotten the most downloads were like in response to questions that clients had already asked me. So if you're thinking, oh, I don't know what my podcast will be about or what I'll create or what if I run out of ideas, what your clients ask you is often like the best source. So one of my most popular podcast episodes is, I think I said something like 6 things I would have prepared before I created a group program. We'll link it in the show notes. But that episode was a response to a question I get a lot. Is like, what would you have prepared before you launch your first group, like your first round? I literally just was chatting to a client about that today. In fact, that's a question I get a lot. So I created a podcast episode on it. So therefore, people are thinking about that problem. There's the podcast episode for it. So that is how I source my ideas. And later on at the end of this list, you might be listening in and thinking like, okay, but does it actually lead to sales? That's what I would be thinking anyway. So at the very end, I'm going to share how I make sure that this podcast doesn't just lead to downloads, but leads to sales too. So that was lesson 5. And now I want to share a little bit about how I actually record and structure my content. And this is from a mentor who taught me this, and I really liked his style. And basically what he says is he writes down the notes, writes down the thoughts, and then he thinks of stories that really support the thoughts or the ideas or the lessons that he's sharing in the podcast. So when I have a little bit more space, or even before a podcast, generally speaking, I try to think of stories that I can share that would be relevant to to what I'm actually sharing in the episode, because I think it makes the episode a lot more interesting, easy to listen to when you're not just learning, but you're listening to stories as well. So when you can, write down your notes, but then think of stories to support you. Like even earlier, I shared a little bit about when I thought back to my previous self. I looked back in my email, like in my notes, and listened to the podcast that I listened to. That's a small version. I usually like to think of deeper stories. But thinking about stories that can help you illustrate your concept, and it can make your podcast more interesting to listen to. So that was lesson 6. Lesson 7 is related to this. But one of the things that I found as I was listening to my current mentor is she would share some behind the scenes. She would kind of set the scene as to where she was recording her episode from. And what I really liked about it was that she would share like what her daughter was doing, what was going on with her family that day. And what I loved about it is it gave me permission to have a less than perfect, podcast. Like she would share like her daughter's about to come in and she's finishing up this podcast episode. And the other thing that I really like about it is it really clarified that we have similar values, that her business is about supporting her family and she always puts her kids and family first, or she's always balancing the needs of her family and the needs of her kids. And so having that background made me realize I don't just like the lessons that she's sharing or the tips or strategies. I also align with her values. And so I have started sharing some behind the scenes of that because I want my listeners to get a sense of who I am as a person, what my life looks like, what my values are. And also I want to give you permission that it doesn't have to be perfect, because that's one of the things that I get a lot is even from my ads. People say like, oh, you were just in your at your office and just recorded a reel. And I was like, yeah, it doesn't have to be super complicated. So that's part of my brand. And so I like to share stories and behind the scenes of what's going on as I record, because it kind of brings you into my world. And I learned that from listening to other people. So that's another thing you can even think about, like in the podcast episodes that you like, what is it that they do? And can you bring that into your own show? Now I'd love to share it for lesson 8. One of the struggles that I've had is thinking about podcast titles, because if you are anything like me and my clients, maybe marketing and catchy titles does not come to you as easily. It doesn't come super naturally to you. I know it doesn't come that way for a lot of my clients. There's a story that a lot of us have that they're bad at marketing or bad at sales, and that is not true. It is a skill, but sometimes you can feel stuck on the titles, right? So one of the ways that I love to find titles is I look through podcast episodes that I've listened to, and I've noticed which podcast episode titles got my attention, and I started looking like, what is it about them that made me listen? Was it that there's a number? What was the hook like? And I start teaching myself like, oh, that was interesting for me. How can I make that title, not the same title, obviously, but that kind of hook, that kind of style work for my episodes? So start to look at your own behavior and noticing what podcasts or Substack or whatever it is that you're creating, what got your attention and what was the format or the structure for that title. And how can you use that for your own content as inspiration? So that is lesson number 8, using other podcasts as headline inspiration for your marketing. Number 9 is around AI. So how do I use AI? How do I make it work for me in my podcast episodes? So my last lesson around this is I do not like using AI for content. I like using it for data analysis. So at one point I was trying to move a little bit faster and have Claude like organize my ideas and things like that. For me personally, because I organize ideas on a regular basis, it's one of my strengths. I didn't find it that helpful. And in fact, I find using Claude and other AI tools honestly slows down my process, and it doesn't feel like me. It's harder to actually create it. It's a little bit like following someone else's lesson plan, honestly, as a teacher. So personally, I do not use Claude for any of my content. I might use it for some brainstorming, but by and large, I don't use AI for my content because it makes my actual production slower and it doesn't feel aligned. It doesn't feel like me. What I do use it for, though, is I feed it my data so it can give me analysis of things that I may have skipped. So I will feed it my top downloads, my most listened to podcast episodes, and have it look for trends. And it can say these kinds of episode titles work best for you. What if you did something like this? So that can help you with your actual titles, data analysis, but I don't personally use it for the actual content itself. And lesson number 10 is what I would be wondering is when I first started the podcast is it actually going to lead to sales? Now, maybe for some people, they get sales right off the bat for their podcast, but I knew for me, I was in it for the long game. So that idea of consistency over virality. So I wasn't looking for massive downloads, spikes, and like a huge splashy launch. Personally, I think a launch can be great for your podcast. What I was looking for is I wanted to show up consistently so that if someone came into my world from like cold traffic and discovered my podcast, they could binge my podcast and get to know me, get to know what I'm about, get to know my style, and then could eventually join my programs. And that's exactly what happened. So it did not lead to sales right away, especially because I didn't have it in my process or in my systems and my funnels that I even had a podcast. For a long time, people didn't even know I had a podcast because I wasn't good enough at like actually sharing about it. Now it's in my funnels. So when people find me from an ad, they see it at the beginning of before they come to my webinar. In my follow-up sequence from my webinar, I share about my podcast so people can discover it. And now I would say about 50% of my clients have listened to my podcast and listened to many episodes from my podcast. So it absolutely leads to sales. It has really supported me in bringing ideal clients in, especially values aligned clients. Yes, I could get people who are impulsively buying before, but I love to get people who've already been in my world, already listened to me. So that has been fantastic for bringing in aligned clients. So yes, it has led to sales. I would say around 50% of my clients have listened to my podcast because I have them fill out a survey. And so I know that when they first join. However, it wasn't for the first while. It took a little while for that to really build up momentum. So play the long game, consistency over virality, and that can lead to sales over time when you really speak to what your ideal client, like what I was saying earlier, what problems they're experiencing, sharing your values, sharing how you can support people, then people really can trust you through a podcast and it can lead to sales over time. So let's recap, and then I'm going to go pick up my kids from camp before I jump off from this week's episode. But if it was helpful for you, do leave me a comment on Instagram. I would love to hear from you. And we will also be linking up in the show notes the masterclass workshop that I'm going to be running very soon later on in July. So you can check a look at that as well. So let's recap. So the first lesson was creating a podcast is actually a lot simpler than you think. Number 2 is create a system so you can do it consistently. Number 3 is don't use a script, use bullet points. Number 4 is look back and listen to what you listened to when you were your previous self, the version of you that you sell to now. It can help you think of content that's helpful for you. Use client conversations as ideas. Number 6, write your notes down, think of your structure, and then think of stories that can support you. Number 7 is share the behind the scenes to share your values and what your life looks like behind your podcast, help people get to know you. Number 8 is use other podcasts' headlines as inspiration for your own headlines or podcast episode titles. Number 9, don't use AI for content, but do use it to analyze your data for your best performing podcast episode titles. And number 10 is consistency over virality so that you can bring clients in over time to your programs. And so it can lead to sales. So I hope that this was helpful for you. I loved recording it, and I will see you on next week's episode of the Program Design Podcast.